environment studies at this faculty. Used to be here in the 80s, but it's back again. What I'm going to do, I'm going to emphasize one specific topic. One topic that has my interest in people environment studies, and that's called control. Control over the environment. First, before I get to the topic, I'm going to dwell for a few seconds on my position in this field. Because this lecture series is called Environmental Psychology, but there are different positions and there are different topics being addressed. So we all take a position. I'm working in this faculty. I'm not an empirical researcher. I'm interested in people-environment interaction to see how we go to mold and build our environment, starting from the behavior of people. That's not all what we do. Of course, also in here we do a bit of the empirical research. It's good to know this because this is the major field of environmental psychology in the Netherlands. It's the empirical research. Trying to find out what's reality, how does things really work. This is one of my PhD candidates. She does a study, Julia, she does a study on how people perceive green and the built environment and how this is related to stress reduction. So this is a real empirical research. We take a bunch of students, not from this faculty, but from another faculty. Half of them we put under stress by giving a very complex test to do. Half of them they're relaxed, hopefully. And then we show them different views, street views, combinations of buildings and green. Very limited, because it should be measurable. Interested, by the way, that our friends from environmental psychology from other departments in Holland, they all can tell us that green does have a relation with stress reduction. Green is positive. Funny thing is, if we combine it with the built environment, we do two forms of architecture, popular style and high style, less and more green, and our first result is that the impact of the built environment is bigger than the impact of the green environment on stress reduction. So that's new information. This is empirical work. At the same time, our normal way of working, of course, within this department is very normative. How can we find things that we know that work? We don't know why it works, but it does. Very practical, for instance. We did a study with a group of inhabitants. Co-design, designing with people, is indeed a part of environmental psychology also. We did a study in Almere where we developed an eco-city with inhabitants. And then we tried to find out how people want to live. Giving different details in design, knowing something from empirical studies, and trying just to find out by designing what does people like. Another approach, the first one is looking, of course, at what is probable, what's there, and the second one is more looking at what is desirable. Normative, how does it work? I'm more in this school. It's a minority, I think, in environmental psychology in Holland, but just finding out how things work and can be done in practice. Okay, another part of the context. This is universal, of course. Counts for everybody that's interested in environmental behavior interaction. You as a person have an environment and it consists of other people, buildings and a natural environment. It's a package deal. Be aware of that. And the most important thing for us to know is that other people are for you more important than the built environment. As a person you know that. As a designer it's a minor setback, of course. I also have this very simple example. Picture yourself in this very shabby apartment from the 60s with some very good friends, or picture yourself in this beautiful villa with people you don't like. How do you want to spend the weekend? Okay? So the social environment is more important than the physical one. Well, that's the negative news. What is more positive is that it's not so simple. There are all kinds of relations between those different forms of environment and your well-being. So you interacting with other persons is different in a crowded street than in a quiet park, etc. And that's what I would like to emphasize in control, because that's the topic of today, is that there's a direct relation with the physical environment. You want to have control over your physical environment, suddenly and always, especially, by the way, when you're a designer. But the other thing, which is interesting for us, from our field of working, that this so important interaction between you and other people is facilitated by the built environment. The built environment helps us in controlling, thank you, our interaction with other persons. Okay, that's the context. So control is the topic. Why this topic of control? Because, and that's a strange thing to say in science, because it fascinates me. It fascinates me because it's not always on the top of list of needs. I did a broader research in the past, what are basic needs of people? And then I came up with my favorite list, basic needs. I found it interesting because I'm in the chair of sustainable development. So let's look at those things that are interesting for us, but also for next generations and for people elsewhere. And then, of course, most of them are well known. Interaction with the natural environment, but on top of the list, of course, health, safety, but also control. And our social environment again. So control is in my top 5. Funny thing is, it's partly based on studies from other social science, like culture studies. There's a great journal, and that's the Journal of Happiness. In there you find a lot of empirical studies on what makes people happy, and that works a lot of, there are a lot of studies on national scale. Why are people in one country more happy than in another country? That perceived happiness is related to all kinds of control-related topics. Freedom of speech, political freedom, etc. So on that scale, it's well addressed. In psychology, if you talk about needs, other people refer to this figure. You know this one? Yeah. The pyramid of Maslow. Some people in Holland call him Maslow, but it's an American person. Maslow divided some needs, basic needs and higher needs. It's in different publications of him. Funny, by the way, to know my detail. In 1971, he also published a paper. Well, it wasn't published, but he wrote a paper in which he said, well, maybe it's not the case that you first should address your basic needs and then the higher needs. Interesting detail, by the way. What are those needs? Physical needs. You need water, food, air. You need security, safety. And then we come to the social needs, need of belonging, inclusion, etc. Ego-related needs, self-esteem, developing self-esteem. Important, by the way, in our way of working. If you work in a neighborhood with inhabitants without self-esteem, it's hard to address them to look towards the future, for instance. In there is power and prestige. And then we come to self-actualization, achievement. Funny thing is, if you try to reveal definitions of all these different needs, a lot of those needs are related to control. And also related indirectly in that way to the built environment. Having food, having water, safety. Safety is a control thing, etc. Controlling social interaction, ego-related aspects. It's in there, but not on the front, but it has a relation with a lot of those topics. And of course, the great thing with literature, you can also find always can find sources that really relates to your topic. Piet Vroom, he used to be a professor in social psychology, but his work is really relating to biology, and that's interesting because it's related to basic behavior of people. He comes up with a different list of needs. Need for change, need to intervene in your environment, need to understand all your perception, and interesting, need of your own territory, and need of contact with nature again. Two things are interesting for me in here. First of all, directly or indirectly, control is an issue, especially if you talk about territory. Territorial behavior has to do, of course, with controlling an area. Another thing, and then we get to practice on, then don't do too much theory. Another thing that's interesting in here is the dynamic of it all. That's good to know within this faculty, because that's sometimes a thing we have a tendency to forget. The interaction with the environment is a dynamic thing. So we make something that's beautiful, but is it still perceived as beautiful by the same person after a year? There's a dynamic interaction. I really like to emphasize that. We have another, you find this in different forms, but this is always the same thing. Another model that emphasizes this dynamic thing. And then we get to the more practical examples. So, again, you as a person have interaction with your environment. Top left. That's great. How does it work? You perceive your environment. Yes? Seeing, smelling, etc. And with this perception, you make your appraisal of the environment. Cognitive appraisal. Where am I? What's happening here? Etc. That works very fast. Few seconds. And then what happens, there's an emotional response. So you're going to validate that interaction. What's the quality of it? Do I like it? And if I like it, okay. If I don't like it, you have to find a form of coping. What shall I do to get rid of this stress? Because in this interaction there's a lot of stress involved. And it's nice to have a certain level of stress. Without stress, life has a tendency to get very boring. But there's a kind of optimism in there. So it's good to know. So you're sitting here, you perceive your environment, you don't have a chair, you get under stress. What shall I do? Well, option is walk away, for instance. And if that's not an option, you try another way for coping. Get out your mobile phone and look at your email or whatever. There are different ways to do that. Funny thing, in the first example, walking away, what you actually do, you change your relation with your environment. And that's interesting. You can change your relation with your environment by walking away, by opening or closing the door or a window, whatever. That's great, because there is a task for a designer. We should make a built environment that helps people to cope with their interaction with the environment. When they put them under a little stress, but not too much. Okay. So much for a theory. Well, maybe there's some more later on. Control. To make it simple, let's start first with you controlling the physical environment. There are different ways in there. It's of course the most important thing that you as a designer realize that people have a tendency to think they own an environment, their space, and they want to control it. So how to facilitate this? There are different aspects that you should know. First, like I told you about the coping, what's a good environment in this case? For instance, on the bigger scale, I cannot really interact, I cannot change my environment. Where can a person cope better? Over there, this busy street in Bangkok, or on the top? a boring street in the north of Holland. Interesting, there are different levels of stress, and people have the capability to cope with it very professionally, I think, in different ways. So in here, I cannot say, that's interesting, that as a tourist in here, you have a bigger chance to get involved in a car accident than over there. It's about the same. Because in here, you use all your perceptions, all your capabilities to cope with it, and you can handle it. Over there, on top, people have a tendency to get more bored, and people fall asleep. And they drive off the road. Those roads in Holland are the most unsafe roads. Yes? The simple one. So see how it works. More interesting for the smaller scale, like Heidegger also mentioned, living is dwelling, is building. People want to mold their environment, change it. It's so important. It's part of living. And it's funny, if you look at television programs or how much money people spend in practice in changing their environment, money and time spent on changing the garden, etc. It's a lot. It has to do with this control thing. There are different words for it, but it's an aspect of it. I think it's a positive thing. While it's not always appreciated, there's always a negative downside at the same topic, of course. Control is territorial behavior. Yeah, it's a basic need. So we draw lines. This is my territory and that one is yours. And there's battles around it. This is the border, by the way, between India and Pakistan. But if you design it well, then it's recognizable. It should be, at least, the physical environment should be recognizable, and I will repeat it later on a few times, recognizable and understandable for all, how it works. And there's a great English poem, it's 100 years old, that has the title, Good Fences Make Good Neighbors. Yes? So that's also a task for you in the designing process. I have to track my time. Another aspect that's related with it, with this controlling of the physical environment, is personalization. We talk about self-actualization, yes? Growing self-esteem. Giving form to your built environment is a physical way of growing this self-esteem, this self-actualization. Here am I, this me, this is how I look. So that possibility is important. The funny thing is that we have a lot of literature on environmental psychology, which is quite recent. The literature on environmental design that is coping with these topics is more backdated. Important for, there are some urbanists in the room. Kevin Lynch, for instance, is one that really addressed this topic of interaction with your physical environment and how to shape this, give this form. In here, controlling is also related with wayfinding, the understandability of the built environment. And if you really want to know more, I would really recommend you this book at the end of this part. And that's The Structure of the Ordinary, book of John Habrake, who also worked in Eindhoven, by the way, and lives again in Holland. He makes the relation between form and control in the built environment. Doesn't go that deep into environmental psychology, but what's interesting, and that's why I call it a basic need, that he really addressed the fact that this topic is known all over the world. In different settings, in different culture, people want to have control over the physical environment. I make a small sidestep before I go to the interaction with the social environment, because I like the theory so much. And this was my chance. Controlling also has a relation with inference. there's a lot of debate about beauty, etc. in this faculty. Well, if you go into that debate, look at the preference framework of Kaplan and Kaplan, who really address how we perceive the environment and how we try to relate to it. And interesting is that in here you see again we want to have a certain level of control. If we are in an environment, it has to make sense. We have to cope with it, understandable. Is it coherent? Is it understandable? Legibility, readable? At the same time, we want to have a certain kind of involvement. So we also want a certain level of complexity. Yes, a level of mystery. So in controlling the environment, there is again in here an optimum. That has to do, of course, with the topic I addressed before, this level of stress. When you make an environment which is very coherent, not complex at all for most users, there's a diversity in here per person, by the way, then things get a bit boring. And when things are very complex, then people lose control over that environment. They cannot find their way, etc. Minor detail in here that what's for you as an expert or a professional is an optimum between coherent and complex is different than for the layman. You should know that. Okay. Well, then the second topic, you interacting with your social environment, interacting with other people. Well, trying to get to the aspects where we emphasize how the physical environment facilitates it. But before getting there are some theoretical things you should know. And the most important thing is the theory of, well, it's addressed by Sommer, but also by others, a theory on personal space. You have a certain layers of space around you which help you to interact with others. An intimate space, personal, and a social space. Normally I don't emphasize this so much if we talk about control, but for the design process it's interesting because here you see measurements. So there is a relation between the physical environment. If I design something and people should pass one another but don't get into their personal space, that has to do with measurements. Well, a lot of people try this out, of course. This is very practical. A researcher. He's from Johannesburg and he made his own personal space protector. And the interesting thing is how other people cope with it. Not so much. Another example, that's from two artists. You know her. And Ula, they made different performances where they play with the social interaction in the personal space. So this is at a gallery. They were standing in the doorpost, and if you want to get in to see the exhibition, you have to pass them. It's interesting to see how people cope with this. Most of the time, the man that walked in turned towards the woman and the other one. Yeah. So also for our research, a very interesting material. But in here is of course the connection between two basic needs which really fascinates me. So we want to control our life, we know that right now, and the social environment is so important. So how to control our social interaction and how is that facilitated by the built environment? That's what we're aiming at. And then one other theory slide. I thought I was running out of it. Okay, the last one. Also this one I like also very much. Altman, he did research on privacy, also personal space, territorial behavior, etc. This is interesting because in here we have a different opinion in environmental psychology than in other social studies. There's a different opinion. That's an important one, because there are a lot of people teaching social studies in here. The difference is, we want to have the desired level of interaction with other people. I mentioned that before. In real life, we have a certain achieved level of interaction. So, in the end, I don't care if you want to have a bit of interaction or a lot of interaction. I only care in my design if there is an optimum, a satisfactory match between desired and achieved social interaction. In a model sense, privacy, because he defines privacy as the amount of social interaction, which makes things much more blurry. Forget that word. But we want an optimum between those two. And that's interesting. If you read Jane Jacobs, Young Girl, etc., they all say, people go where people are, the more lively a street, the better it is for the livability. Yeah? We want to facilitate social interaction. From an environmental psychology angle, we say, no, we facilitate control over interaction. So, if I want to be alone, it should be also possible. And of course, people find different ways to cope that. Very practical, of course, in practice. When there's more interaction or different way to cope, you find other mechanisms to work with that, but it's only temporary. Interesting, if you look to the model, by the way, for us, where does things go wrong? What you see over here, for instance, I don't want that much interaction on this side, but I get a lot of interaction. I get more than I want. That's called crowding. That's problematic. Also, for instance, for the livability of an environment, for a neighborhood. When you get more interaction than you want, then you do the most awful thing, and you all do that. You perceive the other person not as a person anymore, as a subject, but as an object. They're just objects standing, waiting for the same subway. I don't care what happens. You can drop that here, but you're quite on your own. But it's a form of stress, by the way. And that's negative. It's too much. On the top left, sometimes you want to have interaction, but you cannot find it. That's a feeling of loneliness. And that's something we also sometimes facilitate, those feelings of crowding and loneliness, by the built environment. And then, of course, a very simple example, a modernistic neighborhood. They really work always for us. Great. This apartment really addresses the basic needs of health. A lot of square meters, fresh air, etc. So that's great. In the morning I'm leaving my apartment and I step into this elevator and there's somebody else standing there. And the strange thing is, he lives in the same building, it's the same territory, but I don't know this person. You cannot look away and it's feeling already as crowded. So you can feel crowded with one other person already. So that leads to stress. Negative experience in my own territory. We should share this territory. Then I get outside the building and then my bicycle is stolen. So I'm looking upstairs, did somebody of my fellow inhabitants saw what happened? Well, in fact, nobody knew that that was my bicycle. So that's a feeling of loneliness. I want to have some interaction. Can somebody give me some feedback? No, it isn't possible. So there are some mistakes in this building if we talk about facilitating control over social interaction. So, conclusion of this part, control of social interaction is this basic need, and we should facilitate that in different forms. And then we try to find out, because we only got 25 minutes, how to design that. Most important thing is that we design different zones, different places. And in every place you have different amount and different possibilities of social interaction. So how to do that correctly? I'm working in the Department of Urbanism, so I'm more interested in the outdoor space. But also over there, the most important territorial boundary is between the private and the public. This is a big step. Realize that. There's a big step between being in your private zone, where you can act and do what you want, invite people, be on your own, where you have absolute control. Nobody is allowed to get there. And stepping outside. Interesting is, you see minor difference between different front doors. On the top left, you see, for instance, a transition zone between the private and the public. And we know by now that that really helps people to cope with their social interaction. So I step outside my house, and I'm still in the semi-private zone before I get into the public space where everybody can address me. So there are minor details that are so important. The funny thing is, we not always know that as a designer. The great example is this block. I was there just half a year after it was opened, New Sloten in Amsterdam. It looked like this. This was the design. But you already saw on the next corner that some of the inhabitants did this. Logic, of course. If you read this, you see, hey, this could be my own territory. This is my semi-public space. I have here this transition zone between private and public, and let's make fences. The funny thing is there were a lot of objections by the architect. I thought it's great. People love the building. They change the house into a home, and something's going to happen there. This reaction always has to do, of course, with the fact that it's also a bit scary. Who is in control? I know designers who want to be in control of their building after they finish it. Also, housing companies does the same thing. I talked to directors of housing companies, and they told me, I have 50,000 houses. If you talk to inhabitants, they say, it's my house. So the control thing is also a multi-actor thing. And of course, we're most scared of this type of solutions. This is a form of control in a country where people sometimes perceive they're completely out of control, and as a reaction they make a gated community. Positive thing, it's a community. This is Las Vegas, 500 houses around the golf course. So what's the problem? The problem is that you also want to be in control in other people's territories. They like it, but I cannot enter. And that's a negative aspect of it. So look into these examples. I've got for you some basic rules which we should address in designing, so hopefully we can facilitate control over social interaction. So let's go to 5 basic rules. Yes? A system of territorial zoning supports control over social interaction. So, which I already revealed, we have this private zone behind the front door. There is this transition zone before the front door, and then there's this public space. Altman, in his book, talks about private, semi-private, semi-public, and public space. 4 zones. If you go to measure that in detail, you can find a lot more interesting zones. My favorite and very old example, some of you might know it by now. I lived for a few months in a kampong in Surabaya in Indonesia, and then you see that within the house there are 5 different zones. There's a private room, and in this kampong nobody will enter my private room. Nobody will talk to me. That's great. Zone number 2, a family room. It's only for people who live in the house. So I can dress, be informal, because nobody gets there. Because friends of the family come to zone number 3, the guest room. Only there for good friends of the family. And zone number 4, the veranda before the house. People can address me that knows me when I'm sitting there, but no strangers. Zone number 5, in front of the house, more people can address me, etc. So, and then we have the so-called gang, the alley. There are crossroads, and somewhere over there, there's the entrance of the kampong, and there's a transition between the kampong and the rest of the world. Interesting is, with these different zones, I can position myself in space And by position myself, I control the amount of social interaction. Funny thing is, this also happens in Holland, more in old-fashioned houses, I think, than in modernistic houses. But it's not always mentioned, it's not always known. When I moved to Indonesia, the local professor told me, don't live in the kampong because you don't have any privacy. At first I also thought that was true because I lived there, and as a Dutch person I thought, hey, it's nice weather, I'm going to sit outside with my book, and I sit over here with a book. Well, when sitting here, people know I want to have social interaction. Don't care about the book. So it takes some months before you find it out. Interesting is the quality of those zones. If a zone is just a place for transition, then nothing can happen for social interaction. When it is transition, there's no possibility for interact. This is one of the flaws, of course, with these high-rise buildings, because it has to be cheap. You can't spend that much money. And I have this front door of an apartment and the front door of the building, and all the space in between is kind of lost space. Our square meters I cannot sell. So make them as small as possible, which implies you design all kinds of spaces for transition. You cannot have interaction. Children don't play on the gallery. This is, well, most of the time they're a bit smaller, and then people don't sit outside. So that's another problematic thing. Oh, that was this example. Sorry, I already saw that you didn't. It doesn't work. You see it. Then we go to the third rule. Every zone belongs to someone. This should be clear. It should be understandable for all actors involved. Owners, people passing by, visitors, etc. Who is owning a place? Informally, of course. Not by guards and fences, but it should be understandable. Example from Delft. You're entering this neighborhood and you perceive that you're coming into the neighborhood of other people. You know who's actually the owners of the neighborhood. And the funny thing is, people living there also perceive this. This is one of the quality of this neighborhood, by the way. It's one of the reasons why this neighborhood works to a certain extent as a social system. And that's interesting for us because it makes it a durable neighborhood. And then, in related to the example from America, zones are accessible. So there's always a balance in different places, a balance between the different user groups. There are residents, visitors, people passing by, and in every group it should be understandable whose zone is this? Who's making use of this? That's important because they know how to act towards other people, and in the second place, of course, it's important for controlling your social interaction, because you can pick your place in space and know where you're going to be, related on the amount of interaction you want. What is a more extended example? Let's see how this works before I'm going to. Well, maybe I should just point it out. What you see in here, this is an eco-village, Eva Langsmeer in Culemborg. The village is designed by laymen with the help of a professional. And what you see, what the laymen did, they designed on top really close courtyards for a group of 50 houses, for smaller. There was a green belt already in the middle, and they perceived it as shared space. And they all try to perceive different spots of houses, all clustered in groups. So there are all kinds of groups that live together as a small group, being part of a bigger community. So a nested system of zones. This is my group, this is my community, etc. On eye level, it looks a bit like this. And it's interesting, if you go there, you find, for instance, this type of roads on the edges. They're more public, they're accessible. I can even park there. But if you want to enter a road between the two different courtyards, it looks like this. So I can enter, yeah, the fence is too small. But if you enter this road, you really have the perception that you enter a zone that is owned by the inhabitants. Very practical, you're going to say hello to people sitting there, by yourself. And in that way people perceive it also as their zone, as their territory. And after a few years, it was in the beginning, people they start to mold the environment, they try to change the green structure, etc. Again, talking about the multi-actor environment, when we make the suggestion of this fence towards the municipality, then there was a big row. Because then they said to us, hey, you're going to make a gated community, or even a ghetto. But it works. So in the design, you know to what extent this zone is owned by inhabitants, to what extent I can enter. And of course, that level of stress I talked about is always in place, of course. It's not always really clear to everybody, but that makes it interesting. Can I enter over here, for instance? People have courtyards, they see it as a very private space, but it's public, so you can walk into the courtyard. So they try to make this type of, well, call it a fence, this type of entrance, which makes it a bit hard to enter. But it's possible. Okay, the last one, like I already mentioned in this example, zones are nested systems, function simultaneously at different levels. That makes it a bit complex, but good to know. Because in environmental psychology, I'm talking about the individual perceiving his or her environment. But the system of territorial behavior also exists for groups, for a family, maybe for people in the street, a community, whatever. So that makes it more complex. That's why it's sometimes hard for us to recognize and practice how it works. But it's an important one. A simple example. A small courtyard in Rotterdam. This courtyard, a few people play, a few children. They're always allowed to play there by their parents because it's their space, it's their shared space. You put some plants, etc. over here, so that's very clear. That's for children for a very young age. And then you see the literary behavior between what is more private and more public space. So closer to home or in your house is private place, and getting to a bigger scale, things get more public. Funny thing is, this courtyard is situated on an island, Northern Island in Rotterdam. This is also a zone. I once did a co-design project on the Northern Island, and I was really flabbergasted by the amount of social interaction between the inhabitants. And that has to do with the fact that they perceive the island as a shared territory. So they are a group in a circle. And for the small children, at first hand, they're going to play in the center, a shared public space for the half of the island. So coming from the courtyard, when you get a bit older, you can play over here. Bigger space, you meet more children, but you have a shared territory. And in the end, you might play also on the edges of the Northern Island, perceiving the whole island as your home. And maybe when you're older, you perceive the whole city as your home. So who's owning the central square in Rotterdam? Is this public space? What is that public space? Sounds a bit like it's from nobody. In fact, it's maybe owned by the inhabitants of Rotterdam as a territorial zone. And other people are, of course, invited, they're welcome, etc. But somebody feels this place as their own. So if you count this all up, then the model from a private space to a public space counts for the individual, but it's different for groups. Maybe as a group I have a private space, a square, etc. So one place can have different meanings, can be more public or more private in relation to the perception you take. So this is the complexity of it all. That's why we will not always recognize it. This square outside, whose square is this? Is this from us? The community of Bouwkunde? No, partly it is. So, but the park on the other side of the street, who's owning the park informally? Who's in control there? Funny thing is, there are no direct neighbors. So there are not so many people that think they're in control. I think we can make that park our territory, by the way, because nobody's in control. Let's do that this summer. What's in relation to the design, again? Well, I think that the biggest assignment, which I find interesting, is again this big stock of modernistic buildings where you see this huge space between the front door of the apartment and before you get outside. This is an example we did together with real architects in Hoogvliet. This is the buildings, this is the type of gallery, and if you try to find out what's the quality of the outdoor space between the front door and you get outside, then you see most space are only there for passing by. There's no possibility for interaction. And what you want to design is, of course, you want to make extra spaces which give the possibility to interact already before your front door, to sit down in the front of your house. That's the starting point to get rid of this anonymity of the building. Well, we make all kinds of suggestions, like a kind of klingel, a small space which you make directly in the front of the house, which could have different qualities. So a transition zone between the public and the private. And the next step, the gallery is the problem, because there's difficulties in having social interaction there. So can we make it wider? Can we make stairs in it, etc.? Try to find possibilities to already facilitate interaction on the second, third, and fourth floor, which in the end lead to this type of design interventions. So finally, they saw the big problem of this type of medium high-rise building, and they demolished it all. So much for theory into practice. Funny thing, another example you already all know, that's Popdahof, that's close by. This is the old Popdahof. I make an analysis of the amount of interaction, you see different interactions in different places in the past. And that leads to possibility interventions in which you try to make more zones in the same built environment, giving a group of buildings their own place, changing the scale of the bigger buildings, make it 2 buildings, etc. All type of intervention. The funny thing is, you make the sketches at the end of the 90s, so 8 years later, we had the idea, let's make some group of buildings, and we came up with this solution, of course, based on the same theory, which is great for us, because now we're out there trying to measure, it is an improvement of control over interaction. Well, the first thing is what you're going to do if you have this type of building, try to find out how does it work with those zoning. And then you see if you live in a high-rise, there are a lot of different steps you have to make, different places, a hallway, an elevator, etc., before you get outside. A lot of different zones before you're in the outdoor space. Makes it very blurry, hard to understand. What kind of person do I share this zone, or this one, etc. And then the funny thing is, if you go back to the location, you find out that the people in the high-rise, they go to so many zones that when they're standing on the deck in the middle, they have the perception, I'm in outdoor space. Yes, I'm in public space. The people over here, by the way, they have only a few zones, having a place before the house, walking down, and then they're on the deck. They have the perception that this deck is a shared territory. So that's funny. We have different groups, and from the interviews, and Marjolein helped me also with the statistics, you find out that different users have a different perception of the same space. And then the problem starts. They don't behave like they should do. Yes? So that's how complex it is in the end. And it's 5 to half, so I stop over here. This is control. Okay. Do we have time for a question? Yes? Is there any question, or is this all clear? Yes, please.
Well, I was wondering, you were showing this book about the gallery type and how to control social actions there, and this came from tutorial.